Continuing with how awful the 14th century was, in addition to all the problems that are going on with all the deaths, we also have peasant revolts that come about as a result of some of the economic laws that are put in place and the limitations on the laborers. In England, we have the Peasants' Revolt, sometimes called Wat Tyler's Rebellion. This came about as a result of the English Statute of Laborers, which had put a price on how much a laborer could charge for his labor, which helped the landowners, but made the laborers all really angry, and the peasants rise up. There's a preacher named John Ball who fiery sermons get people riled up, and the slogan that came out of this is when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And it means when Adam was digging and Eve was spinning, everyone was equal in the Garden of Eden, and now look at these class divides that we have. So here we're seeing a class revolt, and tens of thousands of peasants rise up. They march towards London. The king at the time is Richard II. He's just a teenager, and he comes out to meet with them, and Wat Tyler comes up to negotiate with them. Here's the king, and suddenly the mayor of London takes a sword and chops off Wat Tyler's head, and all the peasants who are there are like, ooh, this is not good. A bunch of peasants are killed, and that's the end of that revolt. But it also is the beginning of the end of feudalism in England, as nobles realize maybe we need to reform this system, and other changes that are coming along. Your book talks about the Jacquerie, which is a peasant revolt in France, and they're unhappy with how bad things are, and the 100 Years' War is also going on, and they rise up and they kill a bunch of nobles, and eventually the nobility get together and put down this peasant revolt. The most successful of these is the Ciompi revolt in Florence. The Ciompi were the very lowest of the lowest wool guilds, and they get sick of being out of the power structure in Florence, and they rise up, and for about 2 years they're actually successful and take over the government in Florence, pass laws to help the lower class workers, and then eventually the elites band together and throw them out, and that's the end of that. Okay. To talk about the next catastrophe for Europe, if it's not enough that all these people are dying from the plague, and we have the peasant revolts, we also have the 100 Years' War, which you might notice is not 100 years, it's more, I think, 116 years, and it's really successive wars instead of one big war. But this is going to lead to a lot of changes, particularly we see this in England. The king, it starts because Edward III decides he should be king of France. The king has died without an heir, and Edward has a claim because his mother was a French princess, but France conveniently had a law called the Salic Law, which said the crown could not be inherited through a female claim. But Edward says, pooh, with that, and he invades France, and the English are successful in the earlier part of the war. And here's a picture of one of the great battles early in the war, Battle of Crécy. In order to fund the war, Edward goes to Parliament for money, and Parliament basically bargains with him and says, if you will recognize that only Parliament has the power to raise funds in taxation, we will tax and give you this money. And so he says, yeah, I'm with you. Give me the money. And so they did, and they also gave him a few other ways for him to raise money, like customs taxes. And this will become important later on when we get to the 17th century in the English Civil War, which is basically between Parliament and the king. The king needs money, Parliament won't give it to him, and they have control because they got this control here in the 14th century. And the king looks and says, oh, I have all these little taxes that medieval law had given to the king, and he starts trying to raise money through these little taxes, and that pisses off a whole bunch of people. What's also extremely important in this period are the military changes, where the English invent and start using the longbow, which you can see here. Before this time, the most common weapon that was being used was the crossbow, which was heavier, took longer to load, sometimes would take more than one man to fire, but the longbow could fire off arrows that were fired with enough strength to pierce armor. And so nobles who are on horses, which used to be the knights, this is their whole thing, is they can do warfare, they can wear armor, and they were invincible in battle, but now they're not. Now anybody who could be trained in the longbow could shoot down a knight mounted on a horse. If the horse wore armor, they could kill the horse. And this becomes devastating for the French armies, who are very, very slow. They just don't adapt to this new weaponry. And so you could have English armies who are outnumbered by the French, who are just able to mow down the mounted knights of the French army, which also means that a huge percentage of the French nobility are going to be killed in this war. It also means that for the English, the king could have an army that wasn't dependent on the knights. And this also hurts feudalism. Usually the king goes to the knights and have them raise money and raise an army, but he doesn't need to do this anymore. He could raise his own army of these, farmers and hunters and lower class men who could shoot the longbow. So nobles get weaker in England. In England also, they used to, their big industry is they raised the raw wool and they sent it over to Flanders to be made into cloth. But since so much of the war is taking place over in Flanders, which is like where Belgium is now, England developed its own wool industry. And they used to send wool also to Florence. This is going to hurt the Florentine wool industry. And Edward III is going to cancel a lot of his debts that he owes to Florentine bankers, and that's going to devastate the banking industry in Florence. Eventually, once the 100 Years' War breaks down, it's going to lead to the War of the Roses, which is an English civil war among noble families. So you're going to have even more devastation for English nobility, killing each other and fighting in the Civil War. Okay. Also, here's the Great Battle of Agincourt in 1415, which is one of the coolest battles in English history. I don't have time to talk about it, but you could watch the great scene from Shakespeare's Henry V, where he gives the speech on the eve of the battle. in France, it devastates the economy because the war is taking place in France. It also hurts the French nobility because so many of them are killed off, and the king doesn't give up his power to tax. He keeps his power to tax. There are these regional assemblies called Parlement, which are not parliament, and they're more judicial entities, and they get some power there. It gives them this sense of national identity. You know, they have Joan of Arc, they're fighting against the English, so there is this beginnings of a French identity. He creates a permanent army, and as I said, he's going to get stronger, and eventually the French are really going to win the war in the end. The English are going to have to retreat. Okay, if it's not enough to have everybody dying just about, war going along, spreading the plague as all these armies march back and forth, you also have all these papal politics. You have, for a long time, Rome is no longer the home of the popes. The French influence and force the Pope to move it to the south of France, to Avignon. There is the castle there. It's beautiful. I've been there to visit it. And they come back eventually, try and elect an Italian Pope, and that doesn't work. And eventually there are going to be two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, and then for a time there's a third Pope. And so you have this craziness with all the popes, and they start excommunicating each other. And once you excommunicate someone, it means everyone who follows him cannot get priests to do baptisms and funerals, the sacraments. So it's devastating. If you think about it, the one time when people really, really need religion to give them comfort and hope, you have all this back and forth bickering, like the peasants don't care who's pope. The popes also have to raise more money, and so they're going to sell offices and be more corrupt, take bribes, and we're going to see a more and more corrupt papacy. So people can no longer depend on their local priests, the hierarchy in the church, and they start trying to provide their own faith to help them, to give unction to people as they're dying. Eventually, the Holy Roman Emperor says, this is ridiculous. He calls a council in Constance, which is near Switzerland, and eventually they hash it out. They get rid of all three popes, and they name someone else pope, and that's the end. And you can see here that the power and authority of the pope is now due to what the Holy Roman Emperor has done. This is also going to be a time period where we're going to see the rise of some heretical movements. There's John Wycliffe, who translates the Bible into English, and he's followed by the Lollards, who want to have a Bible in their own language. This is going to be a movement that it will be connected ideologically to the Reformation when that happens a century later. A follower or Wycliffe is Jan Hus, who's in Bohemia, which would be the Czech Republic today. And he's translating the Bible into Czech, also preaching for reform of the church. And when they're having this Council of Constance, he's invited to there. The Holy Roman Emperor gives him safe passage, and then once he gets there, they arrest him, they accuse him of heresy, and they kill him, which is not quite very nice. So, think about being an average person in the 14th century as you watch people all around your town die. Wars coming through, your town being devastated by armies, and you can't depend on the church.